Hi everyone, I'm Nita Hone, and it's Saturday. That means it's time for Nita Notes, my weekly vlog series about limited magic. We're kind of in between limited formats right now. We're at the end of Bloomburrow, and we're about to see Duskmourn. I think the first reveal for that set, where we see like all the mechanics and stuff, will actually be happening later today. So next week I'll be taking a look at the mechanics and the archetypes, my usual here's what I think this format looks like ahead of time video. And in between these two formats, I wanted to do a little mailbag episode because I haven't done one in a while. So basically, I'm just going to be answering people's questions about Limited. This is a good way to sort of tackle topics people might be interested in, or a wide variety of topics. With the way the schedule are these days, I have a lot less time to just do general limited videos than I used to. So we do have 1 week now where I can do that. So the first question I want to answer comes from Nimbus Alama, and it says, what are your thoughts on how important combat tricks have become lately? And then they mention Bloomburrow, which is, a set with a lot of combat tricks. Generally what they're talking about here is every set, I feel like it started, the first time I really remember combat tricks feeling out of control to some extent was, I think, New Capenna. That's 2022, right? And pretty much ever since then, every set has at least a few combat tricks that are absolutely backbreaking. They've made them a lot better than they used to be. I mean, it used to be basically all a combat trick did. You had a giant growth style combat trick, which is a solid thing because, it gives a creature a big buff for a small amount of mana. And that kind of thing can be strong and limited because you can use it to make combat go your way. And when things line up correctly, combat tricks feel like really good removal spells because you pay 1 mana to kill your opponent's creature, right? And then they have this upside, with Giant Growth, where it can kind of turn into Lightning Bolt too if you get a creature through unblocked. That kind of combat trick I think is fine, and I'm okay with having those on a regular basis. Run amok style combat tricks too. These are combat tricks where they're really good at winning you combat, and that, I think, combat is in the name, right? That, I think, is the kind of combat trick that I think we should see more of. Problem is, we're seeing more and more and more combat tricks that not only are good in combat, but they blank removal spells. And so you end up in this spot where combat tricks are more flexible than they used to be, and, the reason Nimbus brings up Bloomburrow is because, every color has a combat trick that costs 1 or 2 mana that just blanks everything. It makes combat a nightmare too, which that's true to some extent with Giant Growth style combat tricks, except that in those cases, you don't have to worry about your removal spell if you cast it during combat getting completely blanked, right? Like you do when somebody casts Overprotect, or Shore Up, or Shale of Scales, whatever the lizard trick is in Bloomburrow. You have all of these combat tricks that are just so good. Crumb and Get It. That's part of the problem. Every color has one in Bloomburrow. And yeah, it makes, anytime your opponent has a creature in play and they have mana up, and you want to cast a removal spell, or you want to try and double block something, you kind of can't. And it's interesting because I think they introduced all of these combat tricks that are there's too many of them that are too good, to make it so that combat was a bigger part of the game. And to some extent, sure, it makes it so that creature decks are more resilient, aggro decks are more resilient early, and there's some benefit to that. But to some extent, when there are so many of them, like there are in Bloomburrow and many other sets recently, it actually makes combat less a part of the game because you just can't block anymore. Double blocking is just such a dangerous proposition, for example. So overall, I would say, I think it's okay to have a few take up the shield style combat tricks that grant indestructibility or hexproof along with a stats boost. And especially if they're an uncommon, I have less of an issue with Overprotect than I do with Crumb and Get It. Having those at higher rarities is kind of okay, but having them at lower rarities and having them be as plentiful as they are is pretty miserable for, in terms of having Magic be an interactive game. And I think that's a problem. So overall, the way they've leaned into combat tricks as hard as they have, where almost every set has one good one at common that is backbreaking in a multitude of situations, I think that's a problem. I like limited more when it's more interactive than it currently is, where you have all of these combat tricks that grant indestructibility, hexproof, stats boost. All of that's just too much. All right, so the next question is from End the Ending, and it says, now that we've had 3 sets, what do you think about the impact of the change from draft to play boosters for limited gameplay? So, I mean, on the whole, it's not something that has drastically altered limited gameplay. I think that much is true. Now, it depends to some extent. You know, we've had 3 sets, but this most recent set, Bloomburrow, has dealt with it a lot differently because there's not a dedicated bonus sheet slot. When we had those in the last couple of sets, Thunder Junction and Modern Horizons 3, the likelihood of getting like a bunch of rares was a lot higher because of this dedicated bonus sheet slot where you could have a rare or a mythic from the bonus sheet. So we were seeing significantly more rares and mythics in those sets. With Bloomburrow, we don't have a real bonus sheet. You know, they're special guests, but they're super rare and they're not going to show up in a slot all that often. So in Bloomburrow especially, I don't think you can really notice that it's made a big difference. Sure, there's one more uncommon and there's one fewer common, but, I don't think those things have had a big impact. Now, one change that they made that, it's related to play boosters, but it's not only because of them. Like, they could have done this without changing the booster format. And that is that they are now printing, like, a signpost common in every color pair. Like in Bloomburrow, we have the hybrid colored commons that are, generally synergistic with what you have going on. We had a whole cycle of commons that did that in Modern Horizons 3. So it's kind of looking like that's the new normal. And I believe when they talked about the booster pack change, they said that they were going to start doing that. And that's partly because they wanted, the common slots. There are fewer common slots now and one more uncommon slot. And they wanted to make sure that the common slots also had these synergy pieces. And I do think that's good. Although, like I said, that's not something that only exists because of play boosters. It's just a change that they've made in terms of designing archetypes alongside play boosters. And generally, I think having more synergistic, interesting decks is better. And I think that that's what we've seen in the last couple of sets, where we have these multicolored commons that are generally pretty powerful. So, related question, I guess, sort of, is which bonus sheet has been your favorite to draft or use? I actually wrote an article about bonus sheets for Card Kingdom, I don't know, like a month ago, 6 weeks ago. And it covered basically all the bonus sheets we've seen so far. And I talked about the ones that I think have been successful, especially in context of limited, this article was. Most of my Card King articles are actually about Commander, but I do occasionally write articles about limited, and that is one of the ones that I've written recently. And basically, I talked about how most of them have been pretty successful. The one that was a big failure, I think, was the Multiverse Legends bonus sheet, mostly because that one had, like, no synergy, nothing interesting going on with the set, and it was just filled with bombs that, when you look at, like, the game-in-hand win rate on 17 lands, like, way too many cards are from the bonus sheet. I think that's a failure, where the cards just feel like they're there for no real synergy reason, and they're just there to be, there. Didn't love that particular bonus sheet. The one that I think is the most successful is the Retro Frame Artifacts, and here is why. So those showed up in Brothers War, an artifact set, right? And most of the cards they put in it, I mean, there are obviously mythic rare and rare bombs, but a lot of them are like little trinkety, silly artifacts that would only be good in that limited format, and none of them are like busted. Like, you had a bunch of baubles, you had a bunch of Into the Battlefield draw a card artifacts that worked well in like most of the decks in the format, especially the Sacrifice deck in the format. I think printing those styles of cards that are like little synergy pieces for certain decks in the format is the way to do it. And especially when they're not like super powerful cards that break the format, but they're cards that support what's going on. I mean, another example that I like a lot is Wilds of Eldraine, where they gave us enchantments in a set where those really mattered. And you had it's really fun to have a few that are build-aroundy, I think, like Hatching Plans. If I had to pick like one card from any bonus sheet ever so far that I had the most fun with in Limited, it's definitely that one. Because you could do stuff with Bargain that just, Hatching Plans was amazing when you synergized correctly. Like, it's sort of a build-around. And I think doing that is the most fun. And also making it so it's a synergy thing. Like, the first bonus sheet we've had, apart from Time Spiral, which, most people don't even remember at this point, but that was when we had our first bonus sheet forever ago. But the first one we ever had was Strixhaven, and they gave us instants and sorceries, and it aligned with what the set was doing. Like, those are the good bonus sheets. Those are the ones that I think are the best design. And you don't want them to have a drastic impact on the format in terms of just having cards that are good in every deck, like we saw with Multiverse Legends. You want them to be fun, synergistic build-arounds, like Hatching Plans or the trinkety little artifacts you had in Brothers War. So those are probably my two favorite bonus sheets, and I think most of them have been pretty good. It's unclear what's happening with bonus sheets going forward. I haven't actually... Duskmourn might have one. It wouldn't surprise me if it did, but it was interesting Bloomburrow just didn't have one after it had been the norm for a while now, even before the shift to play boosters. But if you want, a deeper dive on my thoughts on like all the bonus sheets and where they stand in terms of being successful and unsuccessful, you can check out that Card Kingdom article. Right. Next question comes from the Burning Train. How much removal is too much in Limited? Do I take the 3rd, 4th, and or 5th Nocturnal Hunger over the Dagger Fang duo? So, when I was thinking I might just do an episode where I just talk about one thing for this week in between, I was going to talk about how removal has changed and how generally it's not as good as it used to be. But now I can still talk about it because the Burning Train wanted to know about it. And it is something I talked about a little bit last week when I was talking about, how Banishing Light is now just like a solid card, like C+ level at the very highest, and maybe just a C, when that style of card used to be one of the best cards in your deck. So, this question is specifically about how much removal is too much, right? And I think the answer is, I do think you don't want as much as you used to. It's still good, and there is still good removal, but what makes removal good now, generally speaking, is that it has the potential to generate more than one card worth of value. And why is that true now? Well, it's because most creatures do that now too. So having a removal spell that only kills something after an ETB ability, or killing something that has a death trigger, or killing something that can come back from the graveyard, like you have all of these things that are, as creatures have gotten more powerful, removal has kind of gotten worse because there are cards that have inherent value no matter when you kill them. Even if you kill them right away, your opponent gets something. So removal has gotten worse, and Nocturnal Hunger is one that performed pretty well in this set, and it being an instant does give you a significant boost. That's something that Banishing Light doesn't have. Whereas Nocturnal Hunger has been pretty good because it's an instant, and in a format with all of these combat tricks, that's pretty good. One of the things you can do to get your opponent in this format, and they have to worry about your mana being up, is double block when you have mana up and a removal spell in your hand. Because then if your opponent tries to overprotect, you kill the creature in response. There's a lot of interactions like that in this format. And so being an instant does have 2-for-1 potential, and being 3 mana like Nocturnal Hunger also makes it like not a disaster when you do just have to cast it without getting a 2-for-1. But like the removal that performs the best is stuff like Savor. It can't kill everything. It can only kill small things, but it's cheaper, it's an instant, and it gives you another piece of material. Getting food in this format is big, right? So that is very, very real value, and you need your removal to be like that. I mean, another good black removal spell is Fell, not an instant. It's only a sorcery, but it only costs 2, and that sort of seems to be like the choke point for sorcery speed removal. Like, it has to be like 1 or 2 mana for it to still be pretty good, because you can still get a decent deal in terms of mana equity with your opponent when you're casting something like Fell. But generally, you want instants, you want cards that give you a little something extra when you cast them. Trash for Treasure is one of the really good, it is the best red common in the set, I think, and it's because it's 2 mana, it's an instant, can't kill everything, but then it has this upside that you can trigger reasonably often where you get to rummage. Like, you just can't have pure removal that's sorcery speed and like 3 mana or more, like Banishing Light, and you just can't have that anymore and have it be premium. And that's because creatures have gotten a lot better, and overall this means you should value removal less. Like, you should generally now in today's limited formats typically be taking really good 1-drops and 2-drops before you start taking removal, especially removal that costs 3 or more. And so, in the example the Burning Train gives us specifically, like, you know, once you have 3 Nocturnal Hungers, you're probably okay. Like, you probably don't need more. And while Daggerfang Duo is certainly a less good card, you do need squirrels or rats and graveyard stuff in your deck, and so the synergy that you get is likely to have more of a cumulative upgrade effect on your deck than taking another pretty good but not great removal spell like Nocturnal Hunger. So overall, I guess what I'm saying here is removal is a lot less good than it used to be, especially when it's pure removal and especially when it's sorcery speed, because creatures have just gotten so good. And kind of like with what I was saying about combat tricks, I think that's also kind of problematic. I mean, I'm always somebody who likes slower, grindier decks, so I'm certainly biased in this respect, but I think removal is generally better when combat tricks are less good and removal is better. Like, those are things that I miss that aren't always true these days in Limited. Right, so our last question comes from G. Trevize, or GT Revise, I guess. If you had to pick one thing that makes a Limited format good, what would it be? I think there are a lot of factors, and I did do a video, I mean, it could probably use an update, it's from like a couple years ago, on, characteristics of a good Limited format, if you want to check that out. But I think the simplest way, if I have to pick one thing, I think I'd just say replay value, because I think that encompasses basically everything that makes a Limited format good. What I mean by that is, if you draft the format 50 times, it's still interesting, you're still doing things you haven't done before, or you're doing things you haven't done that much of. And things that can interfere with a format's replay value are a lack of balance, where you kind of have to end up in a handful of decks to be successful. That gets old pretty quickly because you're playing against and drafting very similar decks on a regular basis. So, for the best Limited formats generally have 8 or 9 very viable decks, which I do think they succeed with most of the time. We've seen it fail in the relatively recent past as well. Phyrexia All Will Be One and New Capenna are both sets that come to mind when we think about sets that didn't have balance. And that balance applies to color pairs, but it also means that aggro strategies, mid-range strategies, and grindier decks are all viable, because that also makes the games more interesting. If every game is aggro versus aggro, that's not very much fun. If every game is slow and grindy and uninteresting, that's not very fun. You also don't want it to be too bomb heavy. It is interesting because having really powerful rares and mythics does to some extent make Limited different more often. But if there are too many bombs and most games are decided by a bomb, it doesn't matter what bomb it is, right? Like, that gets old quickly too. And then I think one of the most important things, for me at least, for making a Limited format fun and replayable is having cool build-arounds. If you have that, you have like extra archetypes effectively, to go into. Like I mentioned hatching plans earlier. Like, building decks around hatching plans was a lot of fun. We've had formats where there are cool 5-color build-arounds, like Kaldheim had an enchantment that was a lot of fun to build around. As much of a problem as companions were in 60-card formats, they were a lot of fun in Limited. Like, those are like ideal build-arounds. If we go older, we have stuff like Spider Spawning from Innistrad. Like, these are powerful cards that are bad in most decks in a format, but get really interesting when you can actually build around them. And so having these build-arounds off to the side that are viable makes a format a lot more interesting to play over and over again, too, because it's like you have more than 10 main color pair archetypes. You've got other stuff going on, too. Right, so that'll do it for this episode. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. And if you want to catch future videos, including next week's video where I'll take an early look at the archetypes and mechanics for Duskmourn, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching.